Hi, everybody. Glad to be here with you. I am the CWE technical lead and the CWE co-founder from way back in 2005. I'm Christey Coley with the MITRE Corporation, and today I want to talk about some hard problems in CWE. First, I'm going to go through some historical context. I'm going to talk a little bit about CWE's organization and its representation. I want to talk about CWE mapping. We talk about that a lot, I know. And then I want to talk a little bit about how we're trying to modernize and improve CWE's coverage to handle current weaknesses and current issues. So first of all, CWE is now almost 20 years old. The first CWE proposal paper came out in late 2005, I think it was. It's mostly escaped the tumultuous upbringing that CVE went through. At this point in CWE, it's more widely used than ever. It's still coming into its own, I think, and it still does face some hard problems. My hope as CWE technical lead is to be able to lead CWE content development in a way that balances usability with technical excellence. Our audience has evolved over the years as well, or at least what we intended as our primary audience. In the early years, we were trying to help people understand the capabilities of code analysis tools. So we were taking a lot of input and collaborating with a lot of code analysis vendors. We also were taking in input or trying to capture things that were being found by advanced bug hunters or consultants. And we also dealt with a lot of work from academic and industry researchers. Around 2010 or something like that, we started adding on developers and product security team leads. And just about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that, our focus has shifted a little bit more to be much more friendly towards people who are doing vulnerability management staff, vulnerability management leads, and so on. That is, the people who are publishing CVEs on a day-to-day basis. One of the big differences here with this audience is that it's evolved from a really highly technical, highly specialized audience in the early days of CWE, getting into people who are more or less novice CWE users who aren't necessarily deeply experienced in development. Our content development has also evolved and shifted over the years as well. In the very beginning, we took what I have referred to always as a kitchen sink approach. We got a lot of inputs and suggestions from code analysis tool vendors. We looked at a number of different software security guides whose authors allowed us to use their content. And then me, who was the CVE editor at the time, I was just bagging and tagging all sorts of unusual CVEs that seemed like it might be interesting. At that time, we had a single main view, a single main organizational scheme, and we really did have an assumption of a technical expert audience. That evolved in terms of the content development, so that around 2010, maybe a little bit earlier, we had started supporting multiple views, multiple levels of abstraction. If you're familiar with CWE, this is where the abstractions of pillars, classes, bases, and variants came into play. We also developed a vulnerability theory framework, which is a conceptual framework for understanding weaknesses in light of how they appear in vulnerabilities, and created a bit of terminology supporting that vulnerability theory. And that influenced a lot of our development, our content development at the time, especially as we were doing hierarchical organization. And we were doing a lot of systematic reorganization, including the highest level, most general CWEs, which we call pillars. We also had, as I mentioned before, the increasing developer focus, which changed the kind of content that we developed as well. We needed our content to be a little bit more clean, a little bit more comprehensive, and a little bit more understandable to developers themselves, who needed to understand what are these weaknesses, how bad are they, what do I need to do to fix them. And then go to around 2019, 2020, we started really broadening CWEs applicable to a broader variety of technologies and domains. This started out with hardware in CWE 4.0, which we released in 2020. We moved into ICS last year or so. AI has been all the new hotness. And there have been some other technologies and domains that we've been expanding into. And these years, we've been taking on a lot of really significant community contributions, including fully baked new CWE entries. Now, that's not new in some senses because we had a lot of contributions even in the very early days, but it's more public. There's more public trackability. There's just more direct public involvement. Um, and around this time as well, I realized as CWE technical lead that we really needed to start imposing some additional quality expectations. The authoring of CWE content was becoming less centralized with MITRE as a central authoring authority. And we were also, shifting our people on our team and so on. So there was an increase in quality expectations in an attempt on my part to try and formalize what some of those are. At the same time, we brought on these newer users as one of our primary use cases who are not necessarily day-to-day developers, and thus trying to make content changes that really help with the usability and understandability of CWE. Our influences have evolved over time as well, moving from application security vulnerability reports and analysis tools, academic research, and so on, into trying to get a better handle on what are the different use cases, who are the personas who are using CWEs, recognizing what their various needs and backgrounds are. And we've had a lot of active community interest. We have a lot of active working groups and special interest groups and so on. We've done various kinds of efforts to systematically reclassify or reorganize CWE in some ways that might not be noticeable to a lot of people. And we're doing all of this in light of an increasing variety of weaknesses that are getting increasingly reported that are not part of the top 25. They're not your same old hard-coded password, SQL injection, buffer overflow kind of thing. And so I want to get into CWE organization and representation. There are a lot of bits of information out there about what constitutes a good taxonomy or classification system. And there isn't any one single list of criteria that I could easily find. But some of the main criteria is mutual exclusivity. That is, every single grouping, every single weakness is clearly distinct from others. We want to avoid or entirely avoid overlap if possible. We want to make sure that every CWE is presented unambiguously. And yet simultaneously, we need to make sure that they're understandable and usable to our general public. And of course, completeness for any kind of knowledge base, for any kind of repository, completeness is a big important criterion. And what I think of when I think about completeness, especially for CWE, is that we have sufficient breadth and that we have sufficient depth. And then there are other considerations for completeness. We also really want repeatability. We want different people who use CWE for the same task to come up with the same results. And I'll cover some of that goal in the upcoming slides. And we also want it to be as extensible as possible. And we've done a number of things in that area, including the broader theoretical framework, which helps people to use maybe certain CWEs or certain parts of the CWE tree that are generally not seen or encountered very often in the real world, or at least in the public CVE world. So I'm going to cover just a little bit how CWE is structured at this point. First of all, CWE IDs are really a flat ID numeric space. There's no relationship between CWE ID numbers and any kind of underlying structure, but we do capture a lot of structure, including in a number of different hierarchical views. The main tree, as part of the research view, view 1000, is structured hierarchically. I think some of its deepest levels goes about 6 levels deep or something like that. We have the highest level, the pillars, then high-level classes, and then bases, and then variants. Those can be spread around through the tree, and there can be depths of 6 or more in some parts, in some of the bushy or deeper parts of the tree. But these CWEs are also characterized in terms of a number of different dimensions or facets. Things like what is the behavior? What are the properties of the behavior or the properties of the resources that are being manipulated? And sometimes at lower levels, we get into language specific or technology specific kinds of considerations. Um, if we were to expand out all of the, possible variations of every single property or of every single dimension at every single level, assuming 4 layers, because we have 4 different named abstraction layers, we could wind up with over 32,000 different CWEs, assuming, let's say, 8 children per layer. Right now, CWE is at 900 plus weaknesses, right? So that would be a huge increase. And one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, who does it serve to have such a huge increase in an environment where there are other people that are like, there are already too many CWEs? Even amongst all this, we do have some classification gaps. And one major point I'd like to make is that a lot of CWE just has not been really widely researched or extensively researched from the perspective of classification or taxonomies. Buffer overflows are a good counterexample. They've been around, for decades upon decades. They've been studied and classified for decades. Maybe injection is somewhere in that area as well, but there's entire other swaths of CWE that do not have really formalized classification studies. And one example of that is access control. And one of the things that we have to deal with in CWE is there are, hundreds of different kinds of access control models. And yet we're also operating in a space where we need to be supporting users who don't even understand the difference between authorization and authentication. And in a lot of these areas where there are gaps of industry knowledge, really, or at least systematic industry knowledge, there isn't a lot of really well-established terminology or comprehensive sets of examples. So if you're navigating CWE, trying to figure out a mapping for a weakness that's relatively obscure, you might not necessarily have an established term to just go and look up. We don't have established terminology like SQL injection in many parts of CWE. To help close those gaps or better characterize those gaps, one of the things that we're starting to look into more seriously is really doing some reorganization and creating intermediary entries that could help better organize important kinds of classes or bases, especially in the area where there are relatively unusual weaknesses that not every single person is familiar with, like SQL injection. As a result of that work, though, we might have to invent new terms yet again. We did it before. That didn't have a great usability impact, especially on new users. But if there's no words that exist for what you're describing, we have to do something about that. But as we go and make these changes to sort of the middle part of the tree, we need to make sure that any new changes we introduce, that we aren't introducing overlap or potentially causing confusion along the way. And we need to be sure that these intermediate entries are generalized well enough and appropriately enough so that they can still be understandable, and so that people can still be pretty clear that when they're doing certain mappings, that they can have confidence that their mapping is appropriately accurate. I've touched a bit already on the comprehensiveness of the corpus, but one thing I would like to note is that when we did have that kitchen sink approach, we had a lot of low-level variants and maybe even subvariants in the early days. In general, I've been reluctant to create additional new low-level variants. We have a lot of leaves in the tree, but it's not a very bushy at the bottom of the tree. I would like to really understand and get better control over a more systematic approach to construction of the entire hierarchy. And we do have some parts of the tree that are very bushy and some parts that are very sparse, but in both cases, we may need original time-consuming research in order to really solve the problem. You might be like, oh, if a part of a tree is bushy, then that's great, isn't it? Yeah, but some CWE entries have, let's say, 20 children or more. It's a very clear indication that some kinds of intermediary nodes might need to be created. but it's not the kind of thing that you can just bang out a solution that will work in the course of an afternoon. I just want to note that there are other classification efforts out there. We know and are aware of that. This will be included in the slides as I save them. Now I want to cover into mapping problems, which on the CWE project we talk about a lot. Even people who know and are sincere about using CWE face problems when they're trying to do mappings, especially for more difficult, non-obvious kinds of issues. And we have a couple main goals here in the CWE project for helping out with those problems. We want to really help CNAs and other people who are doing weakness mapping. We want to help them to find the most accurate and precise mappings that are available. And we also want to help them easily navigate the CWE corpus. We made some changes recently to try and reduce a little bit of the effect of the wall of text. Wall of text is very useful when you're looking at a CWE entry if you need to learn everything about it, but many users don't. We have certain realistic goals when it comes to mapping, I think. CWE mapping is good if we have different people who take a vulnerability and map it to the same CWE or CWEs, assuming those people have the exact same background skills, the same information that's available to them, and they're operating under the same time constraints. That to me is a reasonable goal. How much we've achieved that goal, I think, is for further discussion. But we have a more idealistic goal, unicorns and rainbows, you might put it, where if we have different people, but they even have a different set of background skills or different access to information or operating under different time constraints, where they could still ultimately produce the same CWEs. That's my hope. That's our hope to be able to accomplish this. We have quite a bit of work ahead of us to do so. One of the things that we're doing and that we've published for the last year or two for every single CWE entry is mapping usage recommendations. These are pointers to people who are using CWE for mapping, pointers to them to say whether that particular CWE ID might be appropriate to use for mapping in the first place. And Alex Summers talked on this at VulnCon last year. And we've done a lot of work and consultation about this and a lot of presentations on this. We have a lot of CWE entries that are really, pretty much okay to use for mapping. Some of them we tag as allowed with review, which is like, sometimes this could be misused. You might want to consider these particular points before you use this particular CWE. Then we get into other entries that are maybe more or less discouraged or prohibited entirely. The ones that are discouraged might happen because they're really high level. They should only be used in emergency type situations when you're dealing with a new or unusual weakness that doesn't have any lower level CWEs. And in other cases, we have CWE entries that are pretty much prohibited. Those that we've deprecated entirely. CWE views and categories also have their own IDs. We're trying to minimize the presentation of those IDs, but nonetheless, people might be tempted to use those. And there are some CWEs that are more or less discouraged that we're really tempted to prohibit. We want to be able to get to the point where we can more or less safely prohibit them. But we also need the broader community to handle and manage them better. And I'll give two examples. One of them is CWE 200 that a lot of people treat of as just being equivalent to an information leak. And think of how many weaknesses potentially could lead to information leaks. And nonetheless, that CWE 200 has a lot of better, narrower children that could be used instead of CWE 200 itself. We also have CWE 20 for improper input validation. People's favorite CWE to hate on, it's certainly mine. But we published better, narrower children almost 5 years ago. For example, there's a CWE for not properly validating a quantity. There's a different one for not validating that something has the expected syntax that's being provided to you. And yet still in cases of, time restrictions, or you're just not exactly sure what to do and you want to move on, a lot of people just map to CWE 20 and then they're done with it. And recently I heard a podcast with some software security experts talking specifically about this particular kind of problem. There's any number of pillars that probably would be good for us, and then other kinds of CWEs that are currently discouraged. And maybe at some point we would be able to, or we want to be able to get to the point of prohibiting. But we need community input and we need community help in doing that. Okay, moving on. I've misplaced my slides. There we go. And so we do recognize that there are some real world limitations affecting mapping accuracy and precision. People have limited time or limited expertise to do mapping. And there are often conflicting goals in, say, writing up a CVE vulnerability description or analyzing vulnerability. There might be conflicting goals between doing that and really understanding and digging into what the underlying root cause weakness is. We've been advocating for a while now that we do believe that CNAs, especially developers, really are best performed to, they're really best positioned to perform the most accurate, precise CWE mappings. They have access to the source code, they know the context in which their product is expected to operate, so on and so forth. However, as developers don't have a lot of time. But then we also have the simple fact that developers, by nature of being developers, aren't full-time weakness or vulnerability analysts. So we have a bit of a conflict here with this. Another important realization that I've had that I want to work on moving forward is educating people about the difference between the weakness mindset and the vulnerability mindset. If you're doing vulnerability thinking, you're often thinking about things like the attacks, mitigations, what are the different consequences, doing the risk assessment. Products and product versions, I guess, are important to some people, and maybe the weakness just happens to be mentioned. But all of these concepts, while important for understanding for vulnerabilities, are in some ways sort of tangential when it comes to weaknesses. So let's take impacts. You have lots of vulnerabilities that could involve code execution, information leaks, or privilege escalation. Each of those separate technical impacts could be the results of exploitation of dozens of different CWEs. And so there's no real one-to-one relationship in that kind of thinking. Also, a lot of vulnerabilities can be described pretty well in terms of the attack. If you can understand how the vulnerability can be attacked, it helps you to do your risk assessment, figure out prioritization, and so on. But the exact same attack could be triggering any number of different weaknesses under the hood deep inside the product. So let's take a pretty obvious seeming example. Let's say I have an input for a username and I provide 1,000 A characters, right? Standard buffer overflow kind of exploit. I could wind up causing crashes due to excessive memory allocation. Maybe I trigger some kind of recursive, excessive recursion or something like that using a string that's typically associated with buffer overflows. On the attacker side, I just don't have the insights into what the underlying weaknesses are. And then there's a tendency for people, an understandable tendency, to characterize some problems in terms of the lack of particular mitigations, like, oh, you didn't validate your input correctly, or you're using SQL, but you didn't parameterize your SQL query, or you didn't use query parameterization at all. To reference a common quote from Katie Masouras, every vulnerability is a unique snowflake, especially when it comes down to the specific code underneath. Many vulnerabilities could likely be addressed by multiple different mitigations, and it's really dependent on the context in which a code is being used and the code itself to figure out which mitigation is really appropriate. So to characterize weaknesses in terms of the absence or the misuse of certain mitigations is often not going to be particularly useful. And another thing is that CWE weaknesses really are organized around behaviors, trying to get into the specifics about what does the product do wrong that introduces vulnerabilities. We also have, thanks to the vulnerability world, a lot of vague or vulnerability related terminology that's grown and developed over the years, but it's not like everybody, when they say the same word, actually means the same thing. Let's take just the phrase buffer overflow, okay? If I were to do, I did an informal poll a couple of years ago and said, how many people think that when you say buffer overflow, that it means that you are doing a write past the end of a buffer? And in that poll, which had about 100 respondents, about 70% said, yep, that's exactly what a buffer overflow is. But what that means is 30% had other meanings for what they meant by buffer overflow or how to interpret it. A lot of tool vendors in the early days, for them, reading or writing outside the boundary of a buffer, it didn't matter based on what their detection methodologies were. Those were buffer overflows. And so you get these different kinds of variations of the same, of interpretations of the exact same phrase that we've all known and used for decades. Another one of my favorites is Stack Overflow, the address sanitizer tool, which is used pretty heavily to catch, memory management issues, often reports stack overflows. Now, you might think that that means stack-based buffer overflow, but near as I can tell, it means excessive consumption where you're allocating and using up too much of the program stack, not related to writing past the boundaries of a buffer at all. And then another one of my favorites is memory leak. Does memory leak mean that you've inserted some sensitive information into memory that is then accessible to an attacker? Or does it mean that you're allocating bits and pieces of memory and you're not freeing it after you use it, and then thus, creating a lot of additional excess memory that you're never releasing? These kinds of terminology differences are a fundamental part of our business, right? And they're a fundamental part of our communications. And we can get around it for the most part, but not when it gets to trying to make CWE usable or understandable to people. And another realization that I had just recently is that a lot of people don't really even know how to do root cause analysis in the first place. To do so, you really need to have a certain set of background skills. You need to know, the particular programming language that the vulnerability is written in. The underlying protocol or framework might be relevant to interpreting the vulnerability. The product might have a very specific, domain that it's operating in, or a certain threat model. You may need to be able to, interpret from a proof of concept exploit to understand different attack inputs, and to read through unstated or more obvious kinds of assumptions that are obvious to the person who wrote the report, but not necessarily the person who's doing the root cause analysis. And you really can't map to the best CWE if you just don't clearly understand the weakness, or you don't understand the unstated assumptions or the underlying domain or threat model. In addition, now that it's, almost 20 years later since the beginning of CWE and going further than that, we now have a lot of weakness-oriented chain analysis. Some companies such as Red Hat are doing this pretty extensively. But what chains do is they separate the primary issues, the real root causes, from the more resultant issues. And let's take, for examples, out of bounds write or use after free. If your code is getting to a point where it is writing data out of bounds, or where it is accessing, some kind of buffer after it has been freed, it already made another mistake, a root cause mistake earlier in the process. But it's only recently that there's been greater attention paid to these kinds of chains. And so that's a further complication here as we think about root cause analysis. There are also a number of different mapping assumptions that are made that are pretty common. One of them is choosing higher level mappings when lower level mappings are available. Maybe a higher level mapping is something that shows up first when you're doing matching. And one common example is CWE 77, which says command injection. People might choose that for an OS command injection issue, which is actually CWE 78, a lower level CWE that it's available. For many people, when they think about commands, they only really think about shell commands, but there's lots of different command languages, and that's what the more general CWE 77 is for. In addition, people who do vulnerability impact kind of thinking might be like, well, if an attacker can provide and execute OS commands, that means OS command injection. And in that sense, yes. But a lot of exploits use other kinds of weaknesses, other kinds of mistakes, and they want to prove remote code execution. So they're going to go and execute shell commands. They're going to go and pop calc. Um, but really what CWE 78, the lower level OS command injection weakness, is talking about is when the product is intentionally trying to construct an OS command using externally influenced input. So these are some areas where there can be different kinds of mapping assumptions or mapping errors where people choose higher level, more general CWEs when lower level CWEs are more applicable. Then there are, I think, what sometimes are simplistic root cause assumptions that people make. One of the most common ones that I struggle against is people who think that injection errors are due to poor input validation. And that's not really true. Input validation helps a lot with injection errors, but especially when you're, building up complex data structures or data outputs, it's really ultimately about properly encoding your outputs so that you're ensuring that you're separating the data from the control. At any rate, these different kinds of simplistic assumptions might be made, and then that can lead you into different parts of classifying the root cause than one might anticipate or than one might hope. Another factor in mapping is which views people are using. We do have a couple views that are really complete, that they cover all 943 weaknesses of in CWE 4.17. The most well-known one is the research view, view 1000, which is only consistent of weaknesses. But as of about a year or two, we also created a separate view of comprehensive categories, which is a two-layer view, which has 22 mutually exclusive categories at the top, and with every other single weakness hanging underneath it. An example of one category in this view is memory safety. Memory safety is sort of scattered throughout the research view because the behaviors involved in memory safety actually vary widely, but they're nicely collected in the comprehensive view under a single CWE category. A lot of views, by design, really intentionally only use a subset of weaknesses. So there's view 1003, which has been used traditionally heavily by NVD and by many others. There's view 1194, which is a hardware-specific view. And then there's a more developer-friendly view, 699, that sees quite a bit of use as well. Even view 699, though, only covers about 400 CWE entries or something along those lines, not all 900 plus. And a point to make is that reliance on these kinds of incomplete views can then further affect mapping accuracy and precision. We also have some occasional situations where the exact same vulnerability, the exact same issue could potentially be mapped to multiple CWEs at different layers of abstraction. That's a fine detail. I'm not going to get into it today for purpose of time. All right, so what are we doing? What are we going to do for improving CWE content? We want to make sure that CWE is more clearly recognizable and applicable either to new users or to people who are operating in new kinds of domains. One of the challenges here is that we have tried to systematically organize weaknesses using the vulnerability theory framework, which has its own special concepts and terms that people are just not necessarily going to be familiar with. In addition, a realization that I've had in recent years is that theory is hard to teach without teaching people about more specific examples. And this is something that applies across all different kinds of industries and specialties, not just cybersecurity, let alone CVE and CWE. Another realization I've had over the past couple of years is that a lot of new technologies come out, or there's a lot of interest in CWEs for new technologies that turn out to mostly have more or less the same weaknesses, but it's just not recognizable as such. Maybe the new technologies have domain-specific terminology or domain-specific perspectives. And we get a lot of requests or a lot of people saying, I really like CWE XYZ, but I want one for a specific kind of technology, such as cloud or AI, machine learning, and so on. That's one area where we need to work on improving recognizability. And there are still some interesting gaps that these new technologies bring up. I don't want to imagine otherwise. I don't want to state otherwise. But still, there's a lot of stuff in there that needs to be able to be more recognizable to people. And we do have other content challenges like disconnects between CWE names and descriptions where they're just not 100% in alignment. And that's an area of improvement I'd like to make over the coming years. And we also have to reflect that, words and meanings change over time or with different audiences. I gave a couple of examples a few slides ago about phrases like even buffer overflow, stack overflow, and memory leak. But, for example, the phrase classic overflow is something that started emerging in mid to late 2000s because vulnerability researchers were finding weird kinds of non-obvious or less obvious buffer overflows, besides where you're just stuffing way too much data into a buffer that's way too small to handle that data. I'm not sure what the phrase classic overflow means or is interpreted as anymore. And yet, those terms are, or at least were at some point, in very common use. We also have a handful of CWEs that really need some kind of deprecation or some kind of significant change, one of which actually was in the top 25. But they seem recognizable and applicable to people, so people still use them. And some of these are really very popular. So one thing we need to figure out is how do we deprecate these or otherwise change them significantly, but do it in ways that minimize disruption to all of CWE's users? We have a number of different questions that we face as we want to build up CWE, do our content generation faster and with more. And one of the main questions we want to ask is how much does CWE really need to grow? How many new CWEs are really needed and by whom? We have some people who are like, oh, there's too many CWEs already, and others who are like, no, I want lots and lots of sub-variants, subatomic variants, and so on. We obviously can't make both parties happy, but we need to serve the needs as best we can of both kinds of parties. Another area of completeness is, how many existing CWEs really still need some key elements provided. The quality expectations have grown over the years. The completeness expectations have grown over the years. We still have an older repository, which needs a lot more attention paid to it, maintenance-wise, to really make it much more complete and useful to users. And we consider, use cases and personas as part of that prioritization, also in consultation with our user experience working group. We've done some of this work in the past. We've had community involvement since the beginning, but we do have a lot more active, regular community involvement and engagement, including the CDR, the Content Development Repository, where people who submit suggested changes to CWE can go and then monitor and track the changes as we conduct reviews and make modifications to those suggestions, and then ultimately integrate them into CWE. These days, though, it's difficult to really write what counts as a good CWE based on quality expectations. That's assuming we can get to the point of understanding what the weakness is in the first place. A lot of issues, a lot of vulnerabilities are easily understood by other kinds of criteria, but it can be very difficult to tease out what the underlying weakness is in the first place. And so there's a lot of work that goes on in there. And we've dealt with a lot of public CDR submissions that it's not really clear what the underlying weakness is, and it requires a lot of back and forth to kind of figure that out. And the quality guidelines in general, they exist. They're not as formal as a specific line item checklist, but they're close. But they're pages and pages, and it's still way too much for people who just want to contribute casually to CWE. And we also face questions. So I've talked a little bit about entry completeness and entry quality and element quality of the individual elements. But we also need to consider timeliness, right? We want CWE to put out new stuff as quickly as possible, but what if what we put out isn't perfect? It's a little bit more easily handleable if we're making modifications to existing CWEs. Drew Butner, who used to be the CWE project lead, would always frame questions as, if we make this modification, is the entry better than it was? And if so, that's a pretty good criterion for making updates to new entries at the very least. But we still need to consider balancing the timeliness with the quality that we're producing. We don't want to put out CWEs that are patently inaccurate or effectively tell, developers to do things that are fundamentally insecure, or say to apply a mitigation that really doesn't help, even though it might be something that a lot of people do. So we want to really balance out that quality and the speed. Speaking of quality, let's take a look at an original demonstrative example by some guy named, Steve Christey. And that was his name at the time, so that's how long ago it is. Just take a quick look at this demonstrative example from CWE 95 eval injection. It took a long time to write up this example. And hey, it's got some pretty good looking code here. It's kind of realistic, but maybe it's too realistic. It's written in a language called Perl, which who writes Perl these days? But this is one of the challenges for any kind of demonstrative example, right? If it's written in a language that the reader doesn't understand, then there's only so much you can really do. This is an old CWE. This demonstrative example was put into CWE before CWE 1.0. So there's this technology called CGI that used to exist, still exists, but it used to be better well known or understood back then. And there's just a lot of excess code here in a way, because it's trying to be a little bit too realistic. But it's just not necessarily going to be understandable to a lot of readers. But it's definitely a little bit too extensive as a first example to present to your users. And yet it's still pretty good. And still, it wouldn't satisfy every single checkbox for our quality expectations these days, but it's still pretty good. But we have a lot of content that's like this, that we have examples, we have them filled out, but they aren't necessarily up to snuff relative to our current quality expectations. And one general question, and this is for the public entirely, is what quality expectations should the general public have? What cases is it okay for us to reduce or let go of certain quality expectations, to not allow perfect to become the enemy of the good, basically? So that's just a general question we'd love to hear from you about. Now, I want to talk about other challenges we have, especially with adding new entries to CWE, where we have to deal with questions of abstraction and especially preventing overlap. We don't want to put new entries into CWE that overlap other entries. It's just plain bad. Then what happens is we have proposals that can then become difficult to squeeze into an existing hierarchy. So to give a more easy to understand example, let's talk about animal classification. Let's say that we're coming up with a scheme to classify animals based on the number of legs and the number of arms. We have here a nice little layout. Okay, we've got, humans and kangaroos have 2 legs and 2 arms. Horses have 4 legs and no arms. And then an intermediate question is, well, is there anything out there with 2 legs and 0 arms, or 4 legs and 2 arms? Maybe that's an area where we could beef up our hierarchy. Sure. Okay, birds, you could say that birds have 2 legs and 0 arms, but then you get into a philosophical question of like, well, are wings arms? Do we maybe need to define wings as certain kinds of arms? And then you've got centaurs, right? Centaurs have 4 legs and 2 arms, at least as I understand it. But then you might also be like, well, do centaurs are fictional, and some people might say birds aren't real. So should we even be including those in the first place? And then some smart aleck comes along and asks, well, what about an octopus? How do we cover an octopus? And then you get into the question of like, well, does an octopus have 8 legs and 0 arms? Or does it have 0 legs and 8 arms? But we're talking about a combination of legs and arms, 2 different kinds of dimensions here. And maybe we need to pick one and then define what we mean by legs, and then also define what we mean by arms. So our nice, clean, pretty looking hierarchy is starting to get a little bit messier. So then along comes somebody else and says, hey, it's really important that some animals lay eggs. So we should have some kind of identifier for all animals that lay eggs. And okay, so that covers octopus, wherever that lives, covers birds and platypus. They live in other parts of the hierarchy. We can't create a single ID or a single, central node that covers those three without otherwise breaking other kinds of pretty clean looking relationships. And then also you get into a question of chairs. Somebody might be like, oh, this works for classifying chairs. All right, a chair is not an animal. Well, okay, what about a chair that is for a child and it's in the shape of, it's in the shape of a dinosaur or a kangaroo or something like that. So then you get into these weird kind of philosophical questions of like, well, is a chair most like a platypus with 4 legs and 0 arms, or is it more like a centaur with 4 legs and 2 arms? And who really gets to decide this and what this organizational scheme should do? And that's where a lot of public discussion comes into play. And then separately, what are the implications for mapping? We might hear, oh, I have a report about a new animal. It's got 2 arms. Well, how many legs does it have? I don't know. Well, then we can't classify it in the current hierarchy. This is an instance of not having real sufficient information to be able to classify something appropriately, even with some kind of a simplistic hierarchy such as this. Now, you might be saying, what does this have to do with CWE? Well, I hope it's pretty clear. We have 4 levels of abstraction with pillars all the way down to variance. We have different parts of the tree that break along different facets or dimensions, such as the behavior, technology, resource, and so on. And so when we get proposals that sort of cross multiple dimensions, it's not entirely sure what we can do to address that. And we've had many opportunities to introduce overlap, but we've been minimizing that in real life. But what that sometimes means is holding back on things and trying to figure out where they fit. And at least for a future of 5.0, of CWE 5.0, I would like to at least be able to formalize or specify what some of these dimensions are. Some people might feel helpful and say, hey, just use an ontology. Understandable, but we have a flat ID namespace for reasons, so we can't necessarily do that immediately. So for my conclusion, CWE has grown very much since the initial kitchen sink way back when in 2005, 2006. It still needs to grow both in breadth and depth and usability, and you all in the community can help. You can help us by providing feedback, and you can help us by submitting new content. And with that, I'm open for questions if we have time for any questions. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll give it back to you all.
Do we make questions in the room?
Some questions from Discord. So first question is, how well does CWE work for a kill chain of weaknesses that might be assigned one CVE?
So one CVE, one thing that's important for people to understand is for some vulnerabilities might involve chains of multiple weaknesses or combinations of multiple weaknesses. And so some CVEs by necessity would need to be captured by multiple CWEs, by multiple chains. So when you're talking about things like kill chains, I'm not an expert in that department, but it is a different way of thinking. It's not necessarily a pure weakness way of thinking, but it is important to recognize that even an individual vulnerability could consist of multiple weaknesses. So there are lots of individual CVEs that consist of multiple weaknesses, all of them closely related. So if you get into certain kinds of, threat analysis or attack analysis that involves exploitation of multiple CVEs, you could be covering any different range of CWEs as inherited from multiple CVEs. I hope that gave something of an answer, and I apologize again. I'm not a kill chain expert.
We got another one from Discord. Is there a future where all CVEs are input into an AI solution that would recategorize CWEs to reduce the complexity of understanding all the nuances that have built up over the years of CWE evolving?
There's been quite a bit of work that's gone on. Alex Summers and Chris Madden gave a presentation on the use of LLMs to help with that space back on Monday. I think there have been some other topics on the subject as well. But use of unconstrained AI being trained on bad data, I don't need to tell everyone the potential risks in that. So we need to be careful about how we do that. And also in multiple slides in my presentation here, I talked about how there's problems in terminology or problems in, how vulnerabilities or how weaknesses are being described. And you have some cases with, let's say vendors that don't even want to identify what the weakness is because of their own, risk aversion to publicizing certain kinds of details. So while there's a bit of potential for AI to be used to go in and characterize all the different CVEs that are out there, and there has been some work in that area, I advise caution. There is potential, but we need to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were.
If CW gets re-architectured, would it be V2 so that old or existing CVEs that already have an associated CWE wouldn't need to be immediately updated to CWE V2?
That's a good question. CWE has not gone through any kind of major overhaul like CVE has. CVE has gone through, and I don't know what the CVE team says, but to me, CVE has gone through 3 major generations at the very least. But for CWE, if we make any major changes, we do need to be mindful of, how to make sure those changes, where possible, are going to be forward compatible. And that really should not be done without careful planning and lots of collaboration with the varying communities that have interest in CWE as well. So, and that's not something that's going to happen overnight. So we would be ideally, I hope, cautious and take our time in implementing things the right way. Hopefully it's and we've seen this in some cases like with CVSS version transitions, right? Transitions from CVSS version 1 to version 2, and then 2 to version 3. You always lose something a little bit in the translation, or you have to make some kinds of approximations. Ultimately that may need to be done when it comes to usage of CWE, but again, that's not happening anytime soon.
Hey Steve, I understand CW is very helpful internally to prevent future weaknesses. I have a problem convincing product teams to publicly map to a more appropriate weakness rather than a pillar that may be discouraged. What would you tell a development team?
We have a lot of guidance in the individual mapping notes for individual weaknesses, and one of the points that we make pretty repetitively for in individual entries, but also I think it's in our guidance documents, is do not try and force a mapping to a lower level CWE just because it's kind of close. And so sometimes you're forced to use a higher level CWE, such as a class or maybe even a pillar. What that indicates is potential gaps in CWE. It might also indicate that maybe the person doing the mapping hasn't studied, the root cause to the appropriate level of detail to really understand the issue. But if you're being knowledgeable and you're doing your best attempt, you want to use whatever the lowest level CWE is that's available. And unfortunately, we recognize that sometimes it's going to be a high level class or a high level pillar. The more that we can grow CWE and fill in some of these gaps in the coming years, the less the less frequently that kind of challenge will show up, hopefully.
We got one more. Has CWE looked at the NIST vulnerability as a means for classification uses?
I'm not deeply familiar with the vulnerability, but I am pretty familiar with the NIST bugs framework. And there is a lot of good work in the NIST bugs framework. But that framework, I would say, is a bit more academic. They have to create their own terminology in some cases. There's not a one-to-one relationship between the NIST bugs framework and CWE. And I think there are some assumptions that exist under the bugs framework of having access, complete access to complete information so that you can then unambiguously classify something. We have some of that same kind of problem as well. But I'd love to follow up with you, or I can follow up with others on the other vulnerability work.
Bring the stack all the way back to the spirit and intent of CWE, why do we assign CWE IDs? I would assume it's to statistically analyze common bad behavior among other categorical things. At the two ends of the spectrum, one CWE has no granularity. Almost 2 raised to 16 CWEs makes grouping impossible or meaningless. Is fewer better from a statistical analysis perspective, or are more specific CWEs useful in some way?
So from the perspective of, mapping vulnerabilities to their root cause weaknesses, that's our, maybe our primary use case, but it's not the only use case for CWE. But considering mapping, what we want people to do and what we need to be able to support ourselves is helping people to map to, base level and variant level CWEs. And that does mean, in some cases, closing classification gaps. And part of this, trend analysis and understanding, on a large scale, where certain weaknesses lie, that is a major use case. Whether you're a vendor who's responsible for a lot of different products and managing a lot of different vulnerabilities, and you want to get your own developer teams better, or figure out which tooling you need to integrate. Whether you're a developer like that, or whether you're, let's say, a government organization who's trying to manage large-scale vulnerabilities across an entire industry, this kind of trend analysis is important. And the variations that exist in how data is captured and how it's recorded, that is a problem. That is a problem area. We're sort of in a transition at this point of, View 1003, which is used by NVD, only has 130 CWEs in it. We want people to be able to use pretty much all CWEs. And this has implications for doing trend analysis and comparisons. But we're not just fully there yet. And I would say neither is the industry. When you still have huge numbers of people who are just mapping to CWE 20 and proper input validation, there's only so much we can resolve these problems ourselves. But we can at least position ourselves better in the coming years by making sure that CWE is more comprehensive, especially at these lower levels of abstraction that are more practical and fundamental, such as bases and variants.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve. We have a few more questions on Discord. I hope you can answer them later. Thank you so much for the talk. Appreciate
Thank you, everybody.